The patrol car had barely stopped rolling when Lenora Whitlock folded her arms like the verdict against me was already written and notarized. Sheriff Grant Rourke stepped out, or looked at me standing beside my own steel gate and asked, "Mr. Bellamy, why are you on HOA property?" Lenora smiled. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to my truck, took out a folder, or opened it to exactly one page, and handed it over. "Sheriff," I said, read the legal description again. Her smile was gone before he finished the third line. Or, if you like stories where the truth flips the whole board over, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end of this one. Or, 3 weeks before that afternoon, I came back to the land my father left me, 28 acres of oak shade and red clay sitting right up against the western edge of a place called Hawthorne Crest. Or, my property has never been impressive to look at, and I've never wanted it to be. There's a cabin my father rebuilt board by board in the years after my mother passed, or a gravel road that runs from the county highway down toward the water, a dock that needs work every spring, and a black iron gate he set in concrete himself. Or, I run a small land survey company now, which is a quiet way of saying I spent 20 years as an infrastructure engineer. Before I decided I'd rather measure ground than sit in meetings about it. I know what a boundary is. I know what a monument is. I know that the earth doesn't care what anybody assumes about it. Or, Hawthorne Crest is the opposite of my place in every way a neighborhood can be. Stone entry columns with brass lettering, houses with 3-car garages and lawns cut on a schedule, a tennis court or a clubhouse with a covered porch, and landscaping so consistent it looks printed. I have never been a member of that association, never paid $1 in dues, and never wanted to, or, for most of my life that arrangement caused nobody any trouble at all. My father waved at people who walked the road. They waved back. Or, then Lenora Whitlock became president of the board, and the temperature of everything changed within a single season. Or, the first time I met her, I was pulling a fallen limb off the gravel near the lower bend. She rolled down the window of a white SUV, looked at my truck, looked at my boots, and asked me a question I've thought about many times since. She said, "Do you work for the owner?" I told her plainly, and without any edge in my voice, that I was the owner. Or, she looked at me a second longer than she needed to, and I watched her decide not to believe me. Then she said, "Hawthorne Crest isn't really a place where outsiders wander around," and put the window up before I could answer. 9 days later I drove down to check the culvert after a hard rain, and found a sign that had not been there the week before. White background, green lettering, professionally made, or bolted to a post driven into ground I could have identified blindfolded. It read, "Hawthorne Crest Private Property, Residents Only." It stood roughly 40 feet inside my western line, or on gravel my father graded in the 90s, with a rented box blade and a bad back. Or, I stood there in the wet heat for a while and read it 4 or 5 times, the way you reread a sentence in a letter that doesn't make sense the first time through. Or, I didn't tear it down and throw it in the woods, which is what a younger version of me might have done. I unbolted it carefully, kept the hardware in a bag, or drove it to the association's little office beside the clubhouse, and leaned it against the door. With it I left a printed copy of the county parcel map, a highlighted line showing where the boundary actually runs, and a short note with my phone number and 1 sentence asking somebody to call me so we could clear up an honest mistake. I signed my full name. I even wrote the word "please." Or, nobody called that day, or the next, or the one after that. Or, on the 4th morning the sign was back. Same lettering, same green, but this time it was mounted to a concrete post set deep enough that removing it would take equipment. Somebody had gone out of their way, or somebody had looked at my map, decided it didn't matter, and spent association money making the lie heavier. Or, That's the moment. The whole thing stopped being a misunderstanding in my mind and became something else entirely, because a mistake gets corrected when you show it the paperwork, and this one got reinforced with concrete. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, in a heavy cream envelope, with the association's crest embossed on the flap, which I thought was a nice touch for a document accusing me of trespassing on my own dirt. It was 2 pages long, signed by Lenora Whitlock as president of the board of directors of Hawthorne Crest Homeowners Association. It demanded that I cease unauthorized entry onto association common property immediately. It stated that continued violation would result in a report to the county sheriff's office. And it closed with a line about preserving the character and security of the community that I read out loud in my kitchen, just to hear how it sounded. The specifics went further than I expected. The letter demanded restitution for damage to association landscaping, which I assume meant the tire ruts my truck leaves on my own gravel when the ground is soft. It prohibited my vehicles from using the road entirely. It threatened a daily assessment for every occasion I opened the gate my father welded and hung in 1998, 6 years before Hawthorne Crest broke ground on its first foundation. I sat with that envelope a long time. Then I put on a clean shirt and went to the next open association meeting, because I still believed the whole thing could end with somebody looking at a document and saying, "Well, would you look at that?" The meeting was in the clubhouse, maybe 40 people in folding chairs, coffee and a percolator on a side table, an agenda printed on cardstock. When I came in, Lenora was standing near the front in a cream jacket, and I watched her see me and adjust. She didn't offer me a chair among the residents. She had a young man carry a single chair from a stack and set it near the door, angled slightly away from the group, and she gestured to it the way you'd gesture a delivery driver toward a spot to wait. I sat in it. I want that detail remembered, because I chose to sit down in it rather than make a scene, and everything that came later worked precisely because I did. She introduced me about 11 minutes in. She said, "This is Mr. Bellamy, who is claiming ownership of the western area." 2 words in that sentence did all the work she needed them to do. Not owner, not neighbor, claiming. It landed in the room and settled, and I saw a few people glance at me with the specific polite discomfort of folks who've just been told something unpleasant about a stranger and have no way to check it. Then she clicked to a slide, and there it was, a color map of the community with my land shaded soft green and labeled, in a clean font, the Western Greenbelt. I raised my hand and asked a simple question. I asked where that map came from, who prepared it, and what recorded document it was based on. She said it was the association's official community map. I asked again, more slowly, whether it was derived from a recorded plat or a survey, and if so, which one. A man near the front said he thought the developer provided it originally. Somebody else said it had always been in the files. Nobody could name a document, a date, or a surveyor, and I've spent enough of my life around real maps to know that a map nobody can source is not a map, it's a drawing. So I stood up and unfolded the county parcel map I'd brought, the one printed off the assessor's own system with the parcel numbers legible, and I held it where the room could see. Lenora did not look at it. She looked at the wall just past my shoulder and waited for me to be finished. Then she said, to the room and not to me, "I have lived in communities like this one for 30 years. I know what association property looks like." A few people laughed, softly, the way people do when they're not sure whether something was a joke. Most of the room did not laugh at all, and the quiet that followed was the first honest thing that had happened all evening. I answered her once, and only once. I said, land doesn't belong to whoever looks like they ought to own it. It belongs to the name on the deed. She thanked me for my input and moved to the next agenda item, and that was the end of my participation. I folded my map, put it under my arm, and walked out into the parking lot. And I remember standing beside my truck under a light full of moths thinking that I had just watched 40 reasonable adults accept a shaded rectangle over a public record because a confident woman in a cream jacket told them to. A man caught up to me at my tailgate. He introduced himself as Spencer Caldwell, treasurer, mid-30s, a little apologetic in the shoulders. He said he wasn't taking sides, and then he told me something that mattered more than any side. He said that when he took over the books, he'd gone through an old banker's box in the office closet and found an original plat from the development years, and the western boundary on that old plat did not sit where it sits on the map Lenora had just projected. He said he'd assumed at the time it was an outdated draft. He said now he wasn't sure. Then he asked me not to quote him yet, and I said I wouldn't. I drove home with the windows down. My father kept a fireproof safe in the back bedroom closet, and I had opened it maybe twice since the funeral, both times for insurance paperwork and both times too fast. At night, I emptied it onto the kitchen table under the good light, the deed, the tax records, a plat with a raised county seal, a bundle of correspondence held with a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when I touched it, and a manila folder labeled in his handwriting with a single word, access. I made coffee at 10 at night like a man who already knew he wasn't going to bed. My father's parcel was bigger than I had carried in my head my whole life, not by a sliver. The description ran from the county road down along the tree line, took the full width of the gravel road rather than stopping at its center, swung east to include the shoreline strip and the flat shelf of ground above it, and only then turned back north. The area everybody in Hawthorne Crest called the Greenbelt was not adjacent to my land. It was inside it, and it had been inside it since before there was a Hawthorne Crest to have an opinion about the matter. Then I opened the folder marked Access, and that's where the second half of the truth was waiting. Inside was a recorded instrument dated 2004, executed between my father and Hawthorne Development Company, the outfit that built the subdivision. It granted them exactly one thing, and it named that thing in language I've seen in 100 files, a non-exclusive ingress and egress easement over a described portion of the existing gravel road. That is all. Not a sale, not a transfer, not a conveyance of anything at all. There was more, and the more was better than I could have written for myself. 2 conditions were spelled out in the body of the instrument. The easement was granted on the express condition that the grantee not obstruct or interfere with the grantor's own use of the property, and that no alteration to the roadway or improvements upon the described strip be made without prior written consent of the owner. My father had put a leash on it, and then he had filed the leash with the county, and then he had died before anybody tested it. I sat there at 2 in the morning with my hand flat on that page and said, out loud, to nobody, "Dad, you sly old man." I called Mara Ellison the next morning at 8:15. She's a real estate attorney with an office over a bakery downtown. She talks fast, and she has the particular energy of a person who has spent a career watching institutions be wrong with total confidence. She asked me to email everything, and then she called me back 4 hours later, having already been to the courthouse in person, which tells you something about her. Her first sentence was, "Your deed is clean, it's recorded, and the chain is unbroken back to 1961. Her second sentence was the one that changed the shape of the case. She said, "Now let me tell you what they filed." 2 years earlier, the association had submitted a document to the county, described as a community asset map, attached to a filing related to their insurance and their improvement schedule. That map showed the road, the shoreline strip, the small gravel lot, and the ornamental plantings as association assets. It was an official-looking piece of paper in an official-looking file. And here's what Mara found missing. There was no deed transfer recorded anywhere, in any year, from my father, or from me, or from anybody else, conveying 1 square foot of that ground to Hawthorne Crest. Not a sale. Not a dedication. Not a gift. They had a picture of a thing they wanted, filed in a place where pictures look like proof. Mara told me to slow down, and she was right. She said the temptation now would be to march into the clubhouse with the deed and enjoy myself for 10 minutes. And that 10 minutes of enjoyment would be the most expensive 10 minutes of my life. What we needed first was to know how far the assumption had traveled. Who had relied on that map? What money had moved because of it? Whether anyone on the board had ever been told, in writing, that the ownership was unresolved. Right now you have a fact, she said. Give me 2 more weeks and you'll have a record. So I did the one thing I'm actually good at instead. I hired an independent survey crew, a firm out of the next county, so nobody could accuse me of marking my own homework, and I gave them the deed, the old plat, and the 2004 easement, and told them to find the corners and set new monuments. They started on a Wednesday, 2 young men and a woman with a robotic total station and the patience of saints, working the tree line in 90-degree heat. By midday Thursday, the white lath and pink flagging had begun appearing in places that were going to make some people very uncomfortable, and by Friday morning, a white SUV came down the gravel fast enough to throw stones. Lenora got out and told them to stop working immediately. She said this was association property and they had no authorization to be on it. The crew chief, to her enormous credit, said nothing at all except that she'd need to speak with the client, and then she pointed at me. I walked up with the survey authorization, my identification, and a copy of the recorded deed in a clear sleeve, and I offered all 3. Lenora took none of them. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I'd call almost curious, and asked, "Are you really going to take this all the way?" I said, "I haven't started yet." It wasn't a threat, and I didn't say it hard. It was information, offered freely, the same way you'd tell somebody the bridge ahead is out. She got back in the SUV and left, and the crew went back to work. And about 40 minutes later, they set a monument that I knew was going to be a problem the moment I saw where the rod went down. It landed in the grass strip about 6 feet from the entrance of the secondary clubhouse lane, the paved spur that residents use to reach the lower parking area and the water. Right there. A little aluminum cap in the ground, stamped with a number, saying a thing that no amount of confidence could talk over. The completed survey came back 9 days later, and it was worse for them than I'd guessed. 190 feet of the paved lower lane sat on my parcel. The small gravel parking area sat entirely on my parcel. 2 rows of ornamental pears the association had planted and pruned and mulched for years sat on my parcel. Part of the shoreline seating area, the one in the brochures, sat on my parcel. And the concrete post holding the residence only sign was about 51 feet inside my western line, which was the detail that made Mara laugh out loud on the phone. Here's what I did with that, and I've thought a lot about why. I did not demand anybody tear out a single tree. I did not padlock the main road, which the easement plainly permits residents to use, and which I had no intention of interfering with. Mara drafted a formal notice, 3 pages, unemotional, and we sent it certified. It said the association should cease representing the described area as its property, correct its maps, and sit down with me to negotiate a proper recorded easement covering the improvements that had been built beyond the original grant. it offered a meeting. Or, it offered a path where everybody kept using the lake. Or, Lenora read that as an act of war. Within 2 days an email went out to every household in Hawthorne Crest under her name, and Spencer forwarded it to me within the hour. Or, it described me as an individual attempting to seize community property, referenced legal costs that would fall on the membership, and encouraged residents to report any activity in the western area. Or, it never once used the word deed. It never once mentioned that the association owned no recorded interest in the land. I read it 4 times, and I'll admit my hands weren't calm. Or, then Lenora made the mistake that ended any chance of this being resolved quietly and privately. She hired a landscaping outfit to pull my survey monuments. Not all of them, or just the ones near the lane and the shoreline, the inconvenient ones, and the crew took them out and tossed the lath in a truck bed like yard trash. Or, I found out when my surveyor went back for a check shot and called me from the site asking whether I'd moved anything. Destroying survey monuments is not a gray area anywhere in this country. Or, it is its own specific offense, and it is taken seriously precisely because the entire system of land ownership rests on those little markers staying where they were put. Or, I reset them at my own cost, and then I did something my father would have found funny. I put up 4 weatherproof cameras, 2 on the tree line, 1 on the pole by the gate, 1 covering the lane entrance, or all time-stamped, all recording to a drive in my cabin. It took 2 days. The footage shows a green truck arriving, a man in a company shirt walking to a monument, or then walking back to the road where a white SUV is parked with the driver's window down, then a short conversation, then the man returning with a pry bar. Lenora is visible for 11 seconds. It is not ambiguous. Or, while that was recording, I made one more decision that I want to explain carefully. There is a secondary gate on my land, an older one at the top of the path that drops to the shoreline seating area, and I locked it. Not the main road, not the easement, not the route any resident needs to reach a house or the clubhouse, just the path onto the disputed shoreline strip, closed pending resolution, with a laminated notice on it giving my name, my attorney's name, and the words active boundary dispute. Every vehicle in Hawthorne Crest could still come and go exactly as before. I blocked nobody from anything they had a right to. But a locked gate makes a photograph, and a photograph makes a story, and Lenora needed a story more than she needed the shoreline. On a Friday afternoon in late spring, she called the county sheriff's office and reported that a man was locking association property and refusing to leave. I know the wording because it's in the dispatch record, and Mara pulled it later. Not a boundary dispute, not a civil matter, a man refusing to leave. Those are the words you choose when you want a uniform to arrive with a conclusion already loaded. I was at the gate checking the hinge when I saw the first cruiser come down the county road, and then a second behind it. Lenora was already standing near the lane entrance with 3 board members, positioned the way people position themselves when they've had time to think about where to stand. I set my wrench on the tailgate, wiped my hands on a rag, and made sure both of them were visible and empty. That is a calculation I have made my entire adult life, and I made it that afternoon without thinking twice. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't cost me something every single time. Sheriff Grant Rourke got out of the lead car, 50 or so, gray at the temples, unhurried, the kind of man who has broken up 1,000 disputes about fences and dogs and thinks he's seen the shape of this one before he's out of the vehicle. Lenora spoke before he'd taken 3 steps. She said, that's him, not, that's the property owner, not, we have a disagreement about a boundary, not, this is the man whose attorney sent us a notice we haven't answered, just, that's him, delivered like an identification at a lineup. And I heard every unspoken thing packed into it. Rourke asked for my identification and I gave it to him. He looked at it, looked at my truck, looked at the padlock on the gate. Lenora talked the entire time, filling the silence with years of maintenance and dues and the community's investment in the area. And I let her, because everything she said was going into the sheriff's head as background, and everything she said was wrong. He glanced past me at the manicured lawns, the stone entry, the clubhouse roof through the trees, and I watched him do exactly what she needed him to do. He looked at which side of the road looked expensive, and he formed a conclusion. Then he turned to me and asked the question this whole story is named for. He said, "Mr. Bellamy, why are you on HOA property?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at Lenora, and she was already wearing the small, pleased expression of a woman watching a machine work the way she built it to. I said, "Sheriff, hold on 1 second," and I walked to the passenger door of my truck, slow, with my hands where everybody could track them, and I came back with a folder. I opened it to 1 page and handed it across. "Read the legal description again," I said. He started the way most people start, skimming the top of the first page, looking for a name. He found mine, Darius Nathaniel Bellamy. Lenora leaned in immediately and said, "He owns the parcel behind us." Not this area. It was smooth and it was fast and it was the same sentence she'd been using for 2 years, and it had always worked before because nobody had ever made her go past it. I put 1 finger on the page, below the paragraph headed Legal Description, Parcel B, and I said, "Sheriff, would you read that part out loud?" He did. He read the commencement point at the iron pin on the county right-of-way, and he read the first bearing and distance, and he read the second. Then he stopped, because reading bearings out loud in a field makes a man start looking around for the things they describe. I asked him if he could see the monument about 30 feet to his left, the aluminum cap in the grass stamped with the number 14. He walked over and looked down at it. He said, "I see it," and I said, "Now read the next line." He read it. From monument number 14, the boundary runs south-southeast down to the shoreline, follows the water's edge, and then turns back north to close on the county road. Every person standing in that group, every vehicle parked on that gravel, the concrete post, the ornamental pears, the lane entrance behind him, all of it fell inside the walk he had just read out loud in his own voice. He stopped and looked up, and I watched a man recalculate an entire afternoon in about 4 seconds. Lenora said the deed was outdated. She said it quickly, and it was the wrong move, because a deed doesn't expire like a coupon. Mara had prepared me for that exact word, and my answer was already sitting in the folder. I turned 2 pages and handed him the recorded easement from 2004, with the county's recording stamp in the upper corner and the book and page number right there in ink. I said, "This is the document that gives Hawthorne Crest whatever rights it has here. It's the only one, read what it grants." He read that too, and he read it more slowly than the first, because by then he understood he was standing in the middle of something with consequences. Non-exclusive ingress and egress easement over a described portion of the existing roadway. That's the entire grant, a right to pass through, no ownership, no exclusive control, no authority to post, to gate, to charge, to remove, or to eject the owner of the land from the land he owns. He turned the page looking for more, and there wasn't any more, because there never had been. The air out there changed in a way I could feel on my skin. Rourke lowered the folder and turned to face Lenora, and his voice was different than it had been 90 seconds earlier. He said, "Mrs. Whitlock, you told my dispatcher this was association property. She said the association had maintained the area for years, had paid for the plantings, had graded the lot, had carried the insurance." She said it with real feeling, and I believe she believed it, which is its own kind of problem. I said the only thing I said to her that whole afternoon. I said, mowing somebody else's land doesn't make it yours. Or, one of the board members standing behind her looked down at his shoes and did not look up again. Another one took an actual step backward, a small one, or the kind a person takes when they suddenly want daylight between themselves and a position they've been publicly defending. Nobody spoke for a good while, or there is a specific silence that happens when a group of people realize simultaneously that they've been carrying somebody else's certainty around for years. Or Rourke asked me a question I hadn't expected. He asked whether I wanted these individuals removed from the property, and I understood immediately that he was offering me a gift, or that I could have stood there in the late sun and watched Lenora Whitlock be escorted off ground she'd been calling hers, in front of her own board, by the same sheriff she had called. Or I thought about the chair by the door. I thought about, do you work for the owner? I let myself want it for about 2 seconds, and then I let it go, because I had not come this far to trade a deed for a feeling. Or I said no. I said, what I want is for your report to state accurately that this is a boundary and ownership dispute, that the current recorded deed is in my name, and that no criminal trespass occurred. Or Rourke wrote it down. Mara told me later that those 3 sentences were worth more than any dramatic scene I could have bought, or because from that moment forward every version of the story had to start from a sheriff's own written finding, and no lawyer on earth was going to talk their way past it. Calm isn't weakness, or calm is just knowing which move actually scores. Or before he left, Rourke said something to Lenora that I don't think she was ready for. Or he told her that his office would not be responding to further trespass complaints at that location unless she could produce a recorded instrument showing ownership. He said it plainly, without heat, or the way you'd explain a policy. She opened her mouth and then closed it, and for the first time since I'd met her she had nothing at all to say. In my experience, or people who have always been listened to don't rehearse for that moment because they've never needed to. Or he walked back toward his car, then stopped and turned around with one more question, and I've thought about it many times since because it was the smartest thing anybody said out there. Or he looked at the paved spur behind him and asked, Mr. Bellamy, if this is your land, then where exactly is that clubhouse access lane sitting? I told him the truth. I said, or that's what the association is about to find out. He nodded once, got in and drove up the gravel. And I stood there in the quiet with my folder under my arm and understood that I had just won the smallest fight of the whole war. Mara went to work, and what she pulled out of the county's files over the next 3 weeks turned this from a story about a gate into a story about 7 years. Back when Hawthorne Crest wanted to expand the clubhouse and build out the shoreline amenity to lift property values, they hired an engineering firm to scope it. That firm's own memo, which was still sitting in an old permitting file, contained a warning in the plainest possible language. Portions of the proposed improvement area are not within community-owned parcels, and ownership must be resolved prior to construction. Somebody was told, in writing, before a single shovel went in the ground. The board at that time did the reasonable thing. They approached my father about buying or formally easing the strip. He was in his 70s then, and there's a letter in his own handwriting, in the safe saying he was willing to talk about permanent access if the boundaries were surveyed and recorded properly first, because he wanted it clean for his son, he wanted it clean for me. Then he had the stroke in the fall, and he died that January, and the negotiations simply stopped the way things stop when the person driving them is gone. No agreement was ever signed, no money ever changed hands, nothing was ever recorded. 2 years after that, Lenora Whitlock joined the board, And 1 year after that she was president. And this is the part that Mara laid out on her conference table in chronological order, page by page, and it made me feel something colder than anger. A new internal community map appeared. On it, the western boundary sat about 200 feet farther west than any recorded document has ever put it, no survey was attached. No surveyor's seal appeared anywhere on it. No deed accompanied it. It was a drawing, and then it started to travel. It went into the sales brochures that agents handed to families touring model homes. It went into the association's insurance schedule of covered property. It went into the amenities list on the community's printed materials. It went into the annual budget documents as maintained common area, which is how residents ended up paying dues to maintain ground they had no interest in. And finally, most seriously, it went into the supporting package for a loan the association took out to renovate the clubhouse. Each copy made the next copy look verified. That's how it works. That's always how it works. I asked Mara directly whether Lenora had forged anything, because I wanted to know what I was actually dealing with. She said no, and she said it firmly. There was no fabricated deed, no altered recording, nothing that would put a person in handcuffs. What there was instead was an email, 4 years old, from the association's own former counsel to the board, one line of which Mara read to me twice, ownership of Western Strip remains unresolved and should not be represented as association property pending title review. Lenora was on the distribution list. She replied to that thread about a different agenda item 9 minutes later. Spencer Caldwell came all the way over after that. He'd been quietly uneasy for months, and once he understood the scope, he stopped being quiet. He met me at Mara's office on a Saturday with a box of financial records, and told us the thing that made everything urgent. Hawthorne Crest was in the middle of refinancing the clubhouse loan at a better rate, and the new lender's underwriting required title verification on the amenity parcels, including confirmed legal access. If the access to the clubhouse lower lane could not be documented as a recorded right, the refinance would stall, and the association would sit on the old rate while the audit questions multiplied. That explains what happened next, though it doesn't excuse it. Lenora came to my cabin alone on a Tuesday evening. No board, no sheriff, no audience of any kind, and I'll admit I almost respected the nerve it took. She was polite in a way I hadn't seen from her, and she sat at my kitchen table and talked about the hundreds of families in the community and the value of their homes and the years of work she'd put into the place. Then she slid a document across the table with a check-sized figure written in the margin, and she asked me to sign it and put the whole unfortunate business behind us. I read it. Mara had trained me to read every word of anything anyone ever handed me, and it took about 40 seconds to see what it was. It was not an easement agreement. It was not a settlement. It was a quitclaim deed, and if I had signed it, I would have surrendered every right, claim, and interest I had in the disputed area, permanently, for a sum that wouldn't have covered my survey costs. She had brought it to my kitchen after calling the sheriff on me. She had brought it while my cameras were still running. I set it down and squared the edges. She said, "You're making things very difficult for hundreds of families just to prove a point." I looked at her for a while before I answered, and what I felt mostly was tired. I said, "I brought you a map before any of this started. I unbolted your sign and left it at your door with my phone number on it. I gave you a chance to fix a mistake, and instead you bolted it into concrete. And then you called the police on me on my own land." I pushed the paper back across the table. "Now we do it on the record." She left without another word, and the special meeting was called 11 days later, because at that point the board had no other option. The association's attorney was there. Mara sat next to me. I was not put by the door this time. I was given a seat at the front table because Mara had informed them in writing that I would be, and because a sheriff's incident report describing me as the record owner has a way of adjusting the seating chart. The room was full. People had brought their own printouts. Lenora tried the framing she'd been building toward for weeks. She told the residents that I was exploiting a technicality, that the community had acted in good faith for a decade, and that the practical reality on the ground should count for something. Mara didn't even stand up to answer. She said from her chair, "Ownership is not a technicality, it is the technicality on which every house in this room rests." Then she stood up, and she went through it in order, and I have never watched a room change its mind so completely in 11 minutes. She put up the recorded deed with the chain of title back to 1961. She put up the recorded plat with the county seal. She put up the 2004 easement, and she read the granting clause out loud, and she read the 2 conditions attached to it. She put up the new survey with the monuments and the encroachment measurements. She put up the 4-year-old email saying ownership remains unresolved. And then she played 11 seconds of video of a landscaping employee walking from a monument to a white SUV and back with a pry bar. A woman in the 3rd row asked the question that ended it. She said, "If the association owns that land, where is our deed?" The association's attorney said carefully that no conveyance had been located. A man near the back asked why they had been paying maintenance assessments for 11 years on property the association did not own, and whether that money could be recovered. Someone else asked whether the brochures given to buyers had misrepresented the amenities. That last question is the one that made the attorney ask for a moment with his client. Lenora lost her composure for the first time in public. She blamed the original developer for sloppy handover. She blamed the county records office for being disorganized. She blamed the association's previous council. She blamed my father for dying before the paperwork was finished, and she said it out loud, in a room full of people who knew he had mowed that road for 30 years, and I watched whatever remaining goodwill she had in that clubhouse evaporate in real time. Nobody yelled at her. It was much worse than that. They just stopped nodding. Then Spencer stood up with the financial file and delivered the last piece, and he did it without any drama at all, which made it land harder. He read the certification page from the Rye Finance application, the one stating that the association held clear and unencumbered access rights to all amenity parcels, and he read the date. It was signed after the survey results had been delivered to the board and after Mara's formal notice had been received. Lenora had signed it. He set the page down and sat back down, and he never raised his voice once. There was no arrest. Nobody was taken out in handcuffs, and I want to be honest that I never wanted that, and it was never on the table. What happened was quieter and, for a woman like her, considerably worse. The board voted that night to suspend her authority as president pending a full legal and financial audit, and the vote was not close. She gathered her folders into her bag while people talked around her, and she walked out of the clubhouse past the stack of folding chairs, and I thought about the one she'd had carried to the door for me, and I felt no joy at all. I didn't smile. People sometimes expect that part of the story to be triumphant, and it wasn't. What made it satisfying was something quieter. I never had to mock her, never had to raise my voice, never had to say a single cutting thing to her face in front of her neighbors. Every bit of it was done by documents that had been sitting in a fireproof safe in my father's closet and in a filing cabinet at the county courthouse the entire time. The paperwork did it for me. That's the whole point. That's what paperwork is for. In the weeks after, The association's own attorney conceded in writing what had been obvious since the survey came back. The 2004 easement covers passage over a portion of the original gravel road and nothing else. It does not cover the paved lower lane, the gravel lot, the plantings, the shoreline seating, or any of the improvements built after the fact. Which meant that, legally, I was holding a very sharp set of options, and Mara laid them out for me on a single page so I could look at them honestly. I could sue for ejectment and force the removal of the improvements. I could demand damages for years of unauthorized use and for the money collected from residents to maintain my land. I could restrict all use exceeding the original easement and reduce access to a strip of gravel. I could tie Hawthorne Crest up in litigation for 3 years and watch every home in it become harder to sell while the disclosure question hung over the neighborhood. Every one of those was available to me. Mara told me plainly that I would probably win most of them. I didn't want any of it, and my reasons were not entirely noble. Part of it was practical, because I live next to these people, and my father lived next to these people, and I intend to be buried on that hill. Part of it was that the families in Hawthorne Crest had done nothing to me except believe a confident woman with a color map. But the honest core of it is this: my problem was never that residents walked down to the lake. My problem was that Lenora Whitlock believed she got to decide who looks like a landowner and who looks like a trespasser, and no amount of money would have fixed that particular thing. So I made an offer instead, and I made it first before they could ask. I proposed to grant a new, properly recorded easement guaranteeing the community permanent access to the clubhouse lane, the parking area, and the shoreline, broad enough to satisfy any lender and any future buyer. Their access problem would be solved better than it had ever been solved, because for the first time it would actually exist on paper. Mara said I was leaving money on the table. I told her I was buying something that doesn't come with a price tag, which is the right to never have this conversation again. The consideration went the other direction, and it was specific. The association would formally acknowledge my ownership of the parcel in a recorded document. Every map, brochure, insurance schedule, and internal file would be corrected within 90 days. The association would pay my survey costs and my legal fees. Any future improvement touching my land would require my prior written consent, in keeping with what my father had written in 2004, the resident's only sign and its concrete post would come out at their expense. And a reasonable payment would be made for years of use beyond the granted easement. A few months on, the corrected community map went out with the annual packet. The western strip isn't soft green anymore, and it isn't called the Western Greenbelt. It carries its actual parcel number and, printed underneath in the same clean font they once used for the lie, the name of the owner of record, Darius Bellamy. Spencer told me a new family touring a house asked what that meant, and an agent explained, "There's a recorded easement with the neighbor, and the community has permanent lake access. That's it. That's the whole answer. It took 2 years to make one sentence true." Lenora resigned from the board before the audit was finished. The findings concluded she had repeatedly exceeded her authority, had failed to disclose a known ownership dispute to the membership, and had certified access rights in a lending document she had reason to know were contested. There was no perp walk, no courtroom, no moment where anyone shouted, She sold her house that autumn and moved out of the county. The loss of the thing she actually valued, which was the assumption that her word settled matters, was more than enough, and I never needed anything past it. Sheriff Grant Rourke stopped by on a Saturday in October while I was working on the gate hinge that started all of it. He pulled onto the shoulder, got out, and stood there a second looking at the new sign the association had installed on their side of the line. Then he said, half smiling, "I checked the map before I got out of the car this time." I laughed. And I meant it. And we stood there in the cool air like two men who'd both been in the same weather. He said something I didn't ask for. He told me that when he rolled up that Friday, he'd seen the stone entry and the cut grass and the clubhouse roof, and he'd heard the confidence in her voice, and he'd built himself a conclusion before his boots hit the gravel. He said he'd thought about it a fair amount since. I didn't lecture him, and I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't fine, and he knew that better than I could have explained it. I just said, "That's why we have paper." He nodded, said take care, and drove on up the road. I locked the gate at dusk the way I do most days. Across the line, the sign Hawthorne Crest put up at their own cost reads, "Private property, access by recorded easement." Not one word of it says HOA property, because not one word of it can. A man once stood on this gravel in a uniform and asked me why I was on somebody else's land, and the answer was in a folder 8 feet away the entire time, waiting for one more line to be read out loud. I never needed to prove I belonged at Hawthorne Crest. Hawthorne Crest needed to prove it had permission to cross my father's land, and it turned out they never had.